Welcome to the fourth and final episode of our first season of Marriage, a journey full of grace, truth, and time. And this particular episode, Teresa, is focused on the topic seasons of intimacy, staying connected through life's changes. And we are, I think, uniquely qualified because we've been through a lot of life changes. And we believe that sacred and sensual intimacy are available in every season, but it looks different. So here's our big idea. Sexual intimacy isn't static. It must grow and adapt through the seasons of life and marriage. And one of our sons was a river rafting out on the Arkansas River in Colorado. And we were out with him and his boat, and he was taking us down the river. And one of our friends who was with us said, "How do you know the river? Do you memorize it? Like, do you just memorize exactly what to do?" And he said, "Oh, no, the river's different every day. You have to learn to read the waters." And that's true of sexual intimacy and marriage. It's different. It's changing. Same river, same people, same bodies, but going through a lot of different
Kind of the same bodies.
Same body, not exactly what it used to be. So, look, intimacy doesn't have to be lost in these seasons, but it must be continually renewed and reshaped. So we're just going to walk through these seasons. And before we do, what's your overarching thing you'd want people to understand or pay attention to, whether they're younger or older, or what is it we want to offer to them in this kind of overview of our sexual journey together?
I think the biggest thing is that expectations are everything. And so the expectations that you walk into, whether it's when you're first married and what you expect sex to be, what you expect the relationship to be, what you expect marriage to be, all of those things create a dynamic. And so it's really important to talk about what those expectations are and to educate yourself, and that's one of the goals of this conversation, is to educate you that it does change in different seasons. And some seasons are more accelerants, as we talked about last time. There are more accelerants in that season. And there are other seasons that really have a lot of breaks and barriers in them that you really have to navigate. Maybe treacherous waters, as you were talking about the river, in those seasons. And so just normalizing some of that. I sat with a couple just a few weeks ago and just talking and getting the perspective of, this isn't going to be the rest of your life. This is, you're in a season, and it's normal that it's hard. It's hard for most couples in this season, but it's not going to be, sometimes we get lost in the weeds and we lose perspective. And that's where I would say maybe this is something you'd want to talk a little bit more about at the end, but I think having somebody in your life who's walking in a season ahead of you is really helpful, because it kind of gives some of that perspective that you can lose. We've always tried to have somebody who was walking kind of in the next season ahead of us to just help us navigate and normalize maybe what we were in.
Yep. We're running out of that, though, because we're those people now. So the honeymoon season, kind of the early years, and really, I've experienced a tale of two stories. One of it's exhilarating, joyful. The bodies are young. There's exploring and learning and all that together. Other couples, either because of history or because of trauma or whatever, or how the marriage is actually, they become really hard, difficult, and unless it's addressed, go all the way through the marriage. So there's a lot that can happen. We don't want to overgeneralize, but in the honeymoon phase, often couples will experience have children, have the financial stress or whatever. You often can experience a kind of a excitement, a euphoric, particularly if you've waited to have sex until your marriage. But again, it could also be very hard for that reason.
Well, again, expectations are everything. And I don't think anybody gets married and thinks, oh, sex is going to be really hard for us. And particularly for couples who've waited for God's design in marriage and all of that. And they've waited for this day or this night together. And all of a sudden it doesn't go well. They either can't have sex, or sex is really painful, or it brings up some trauma that they weren't expecting was going to.
And they feel like they followed God's design, which is wonderful. And they also had the expectations that would mean that this will just work great.
And again, oftentimes couples feel a lot of shame about that because it's like the thing that's supposed to, like, this is as natural as the sun coming up. And then it's not that natural for them. And that can feel very shameful. And then they don't ask for help. And so now, then they get stuck. And that many couples will go long periods of time, years sometimes, before they get to a breaking point and come into my office and ask for help in that. And so I would just say, if that is your story and it's been disappointing and hard and difficult, please come and ask for help. Talk to your doctor, talk to a therapist who has some training in that area, because it often those things can be worked through, but if you don't, but not without some help for a lot of couples. So that's important. But typically, I think for couples that is a season of learning one another, getting to know one another. Your bodies are probably the most virile they're going to be in your lifetime. And so from a physical standpoint, sex is wonderful. There is, though, the huge learning of the emotional and spiritual and mental aspects of your spouse that is really important.
But if you're not having children or before you have children in this season, it is such a wonderful time to really learn each other and to if
Learn to communicate.
Yeah, and if the Lord gives you health, you got 50 and 60 years, like you've got a long season and time.
I did have someone say to me, how long, a woman said, how long do we do this? And I said, you can have great sex into your 80s. And they were like, you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah, but you can, and so, and we would definitely say our sexual intimacy and sexual relationship is the best it's ever been, and our bodies are not the same as they were. So there really is a lot of hope there. And if you can begin paying attention to these things in your early years, or if you struggle with them, getting the help in the early years so you set a good foundation and trajectory, because there are some challenges coming. And particularly when you think about those young children years, that's one I know you have a huge heart for couples in those young childbearing years because of just the level and the amount, as we alluded to last time. You talk about breaks. There are breaks everywhere and very few accelerators in that season.
Well, I think my compassion is for women in that season because it is a very disorienting season, both in terms of identity. Like you feel so overwhelmed at this little person who literally depends on you for everything. And if you're a nursing mom, literally their life source. And that is an overwhelming season to be in. And I think I mentioned earlier, if you're a nursing mom, one of your biggest needs is just time to have your body to yourself, to have some time for yourself, your own self-care, because everything feels like output. You're sleep deprived. Your body is often recovering. There are just so many things. And you're trying to, particularly if it's a first baby, you're trying to learn. You've never done this before. Right. And you're trying to learn the nuances of caring for this baby. And so it just is overwhelming. And I think then for husbands in that season.
Then I have compassion.
Rick, you have compassion.
I do,
because it is very difficult to be the husband of a first-time mama.
It's very difficult. And that's not because anything's being done wrong. It's just you're just so many adjustments and so many things going on. And this is where learning to serve and learning to communicate start to become such really big. And it's really my first, what I would say, the things underneath in me of the isolating, of not dealing with the stress of reading your maybe not being interested in the way I want you to be or responding to me sexually. I read that as rejection. That's the season where that started to happen for me. And I would say, men, if you start experiencing that, go get a counselor, a trusted mentor, someone, talk with someone and start to understand, how do I relate to her? How can I love her well? How can we build communication? How can I be patient? How can I communicate my needs? What do we need to work on? I think this is really important, Teresa, because I don't, again, then we had a child who was really sick all the time. I don't think I did a good job in that season of staying really emotionally connected with you, and sometimes didn't even do the teamwork well. And that affected our intimacy for a long period of time. We worked through it, and by God's grace, it's been very redemptive, and it was an invitation. But it was It was very challenging because I did not know what to do with that.
And I think sometimes when we don't know what to do, we just shut down and
That's
isolate
right.
instead of asking or getting that normalized. And
That's
I think
exactly right.
that that's part of the reason we're talking about this is we want to kind of normalize. This does happen for virtually every couple that have newborn babies. And it is only a season because that gives you some, it's not going to be the rest of your life, that your wife is going to be tired and exhausted. But that ability to come together as a team in that season is often the thing that on the other side of that season either bears good fruit or you'll discover a lot of rotten fruit has been produced
Okay.
during that season.
It'll and days become weeks, become months, become years, and then you've got some really. And I want to say something about couples who choose not to have children, because couples too, and have total respect and regard for that,
They'll
and
choose or cannot have
cannot
children.
have children.
Mhm.
And I know of one couple that we know about our age, and we've watched them over the years. They've chosen to be invested outside of themselves. And so while childbearing years are really hard years, done well, they also grow us up in our understanding of being outside ourselves. So I encourage couples who don't have children to, when we talked about that dependence and independence, to be invested in nieces or nephews or people in the community in such a way that you are giving outside of yourselves in the couple, because that actually will help grow your sexual intimacy to be people who give to other people outside of yourselves. So it's just something that to think about if you're a couple that can't or chooses not to have children. So the teen years, emotional complexity, and now we don't have such trying to keep humans alive, but there's intensity and turmoil and complexity often. And Eugene Peterson says that God gives parents, teenagers, to awaken them from their midlife stupor. So basically, to make it uncomfortable again. So the emotional stress of if you have a child who's rebellious, or you have a child who's struggling with socialization, or a child whose behavior is getting them into trouble, you're starting to see some warning signs. Couples can often polarize during those seasons about how to handle those kinds of things, or it can even cause them to be agitated in their own identity issues when they see their child going through that. So here's another season that has the potential to really wreak havoc on the marriage and intimacy.
Well, the good news is there's a season between babies and toddlers and teenagers. And often, unless you have a special needs child, that is a sweet spot in parenting.
Like
And
those 7 to 11 years, 8
I
to
would
12.
say 6, 5, 6 years old to about 10 or 11 years
Mhm.
old. There's a really sweet spot in there with parenting where your kids are they're independent enough, but there's also, they're still dependent and they're not individuating fully yet. And that can be a really sweet season.
Go
Uh,
ahead and cultivate
as a
that while you
couple.
can.
So
Yeah.
I just want to be careful that we're not like, this is all really hard and hold on. I think that's really important. But then teenage years, it really depends. I think some of that's wiring of, I thought you were a great dad to teenagers.
I love teenagers.
You do. And I think their individuation didn't feel like a threat to you. I think personality is a big part of whether that season is really hard, and how kids differentiate can make that season really hard or not. If they, completely shut you out, that's a very painful and difficult thing as a parent. But a lot of times, if you're flexible in allowing them to differentiate in ways that, and understand that that's not a threat, but that's part of them growing up and becoming who they are, and God putting his unique fingerprint in them who are going to be different than you, that can still be a really sweet season depending on the kid and the parent style. It can also, a lot of parents are really threatened by that because of that. They start to develop a life outside of you and a world outside of you, and you're having to work hard to stay connected to that world.
If you have issues with control, you're really losing control.
Yes. And so that can put a strain on a marriage when that's happening, and particularly if you have different parenting styles. If you have a hard kid or a rebellious kid, those kind of things, you may have really different styles about how you want to approach that, and it can create conflict and tension within the marriage that, working to get on the same page and be a partner again
Yes.
in that season is really important.
Teamwork and trust
Yes.
and not polarized communication
Yes.
and being a one voice and not getting separated is huge during that
Yes.
season.
And I don't know if you've noticed this, but teenagers have a phenomenal ability to divide and conquer, or they
Absolutely.
work to do that.
Absolutely.
And so being aware of that and working hard to stay on the same team in that season is really important.
Yep. So 2 more seasons. One, the empty nest, and we entitle this empty nest and rediscovery, which may say something. We like empty nest. It works really well for us.
We did.
But there are adjustments.
I thought that empty nest was going to be really hard. I loved my kids. I enjoyed the
Had great
season
kids.
of them.
Yeah.
About 2 weeks in, I'm like, this is pretty awesome. Like,
Yeah, well, their kids actually at one point said, "What happened to you all?" I said, "You left. You guys are playing all the time."
yeah. So there's some, I think here is the season where the fruit of all that work plays out. And so if you have avoided a lot of issues and conflict and dynamics in the marriage and let the children and investing in them mask all of that, that's a really hard season. If you have stayed partners, connected, done the work, all that, I think you enjoy the fruit of that in great ways.
But you kind of have to prepare for it and be aware of it. It is a change. It is
Yes.
significant. And one of the things that did happen in our empty nest years was so I had more space to engage some of my story, some of the things that were inside of me that I had not given language to. So while has been wonderful and we've loved it in the empty nest season, it also, I felt I was exposed in some new ways and worked through that, which has been great for our marriage. So that would be another thing I would say is if things do come up, you start to
But it put us in a hard season.
it put us in a hard season, but we were ready for that and moved towards it. And I think it can be, again, like the river changing all the time. You're like, oh my gosh, now we have time together, but now we're struggling with this. No, that's just an invitation. That's your opportunity. You do that well, and you're going to produce incredible fruit going forward. So don't feel like, oh my gosh, we're blowing empty nest because now we're actually not as connected. That's just something that needs to be addressed so you can get that connection.
Well, I think, and I watch this with people, and it isn't just an empty nest, but that a lot of times our stories or traumas or difficulties don't surface in us until we hit that place. It's like an internal knowing. It's finally safe, or there's enough space for this issue to come up and for me to work on that. And for you, that was empty nest.
It was.
That's when
That's
that
right.
surfaced.
That's right. And so not being, again, not a threat, what's the gift inside of this? And then finally, aging bodies. And as I've said about the one thing that is absolutely true about aging is it's one step closer every day to more vulnerability. Like if you've avoided some vulnerability because you've had either finances or you've had external success or you've been able to pull things off or whatever, or your kids all worked out or whatever, there's no avoiding. When you're aging, you are entering into a season where you are going to be vulnerable. And while I've said this, while I don't want to be more vulnerable, I'm also finding great life and joy in accepting that as a part of my journey with Jesus and with you. And it actually, I feel like as our bodies are aging and we're learning each other and exploring and learning each other in some new ways, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, it's the richest and best time of life, as long as everything holds together.
Well, you and I talk a lot about, okay, but these are the final chapters.
Right.
And the likelihood is one of us will lose the other. And that there's a vulnerability in that.
Such a
and,
vulnerability.
That's the hard part of if you've done the work of your marriage and you have this deep connected relationship, the thought of losing that person after 50, 60 years is like, it's unimaginable. And yet it presents itself. And I think life is about vulnerability and surrender. And you are going to learn that lesson. If you don't decide to learn it along the way, the final chapter forces you there.
And it's much harder if you
it's
haven't
the
been learning
knee
it.
and the chest.
Yep.
And if you have not learned that along the way, because I don't do vulnerability or surrender well, but the Lord calls me to it over and over and over again. But I believe it is preparation for that final season. And if you are willing to go into that place, there's a richness and a sweetness too of the looking back and the sense of we made it.
Right.
And you've weathered the storms. I'm a Lord of the Rings girl. I love that. And I love the end of the movie where there's just a joy and a depth of having been to Mordor and come home and in the Shire again, but not in this childlike silliness that was there at the beginning of the movie, but in this deep knowing of having overcome these really amazing and gotten through those things. And so I do believe that season is like that. But as we talk about sex specifically in this season, it's also the place where if you've developed what we talked about at the beginning, where if the goal of sex was intimacy, there is a deep richness in your sex life in your latter years because the intimacy is there. And so even in the aging of the body and the vulnerability of that, there's a sweetness of being together in that too. And the acceptance and the ability to come to one another in our imperfections and in our aging and love well in the midst of that. And so that can be a really sweet season sexually as well. It's different than the early years, obviously, but really sweet too.
Yeah, the faithfulness over time creates the freedom. And my body does not work always as I want it to, and sexually not with the same immediacy or frequency when I was younger. And yet I value our sexual relationship so much more, and I love the intimacy. And I describe being in this season of life as like when we go for a week at the beach. You get on Saturday and we leave on Saturday, and it's like Thursday at lunch, and you're looking back on all the things you've enjoyed in the week, and you realize you've still got time, but you don't have a lot of time. And so you're thinking about, I wonder what I want to do before we have to go home. And so I think a lot about that in our relationship, and it brings me to a deeper appreciation for you, more of wanting to kind of soak you in with me, which just builds sexual intimacy. One of the things you've talked about as a woman, men have their own issues with their body, but as for women, appearance, and just at some point you are old, and we both talk about, well, we were at a restaurant in Greenville, South Carolina, and this very, I'm sure, wonderful, nice, young 20-something hostess said, "Can you all walk down the steps?" And we were both like, "What are you talking about? Look at us, we're 40." So, and that's not what she saw.
Yeah, she did not see 40.
But for women and appearance and how that affects sex.
Well, there's a grief in that.
Yeah.
Particularly if as a woman you have, and I think most women get a sense of significance or value in appearance. And as you age, you're losing that. It's a fighting battle. And again, I know we have all the Botox and plastic surgery, but there's a point at which you can only prop up so much. And so there's a grieving in the losing of that. And people respond to you differently, and being aware of that, or even just the people that call you honey all the time that I want to deck. But I just think there's a grief in the aging process that your body didn't look the way it did. Our souls don't age. And so we still feel young until we look in the mirror. Or in my case, I try to physically do something that I used to could do. And I go, oh, I can't just do that in the same way. My body doesn't move the same way. It isn't as, and we work at it. We work at exercise and diet and all the things that I think will keep us young, as young as we can be.
Yeah, we're walking up the down escalator, though. It keeps moving down even as we try to walk up.
Absolutely. And there is a surrender to, and if you're fighting that too hard, I think you miss some of what the Lord wants to teach you about the sweetness of just resting in Him, and that's not where our value and worth come from. And we know that in our heads, but life forces you into that reality. And I think that's a beautiful thing if we'll allow it to be. But it's a journey. And again, it's helpful to talk to other women, and for men to talk to other men. Men do that less well, I think, than women do, in terms of just talking about the grief of it. And is that hard for you? Yeah, it's hard for me. Um,
Yeah, I said to my men's group recently, I said, I still get afraid I'm going to die young. And they all looked at me like, that's not possible. Like, hey, wait, what are we doing? But they're all the same age. So Teresa, just final thoughts. We start with this huge vision, and we understand we're in a redemption story, and there's so much more story we're part of. We've come now to the end of like our small S story has an ending point, but being a part of the larger capital S story of God, this is not it. There's a life after this, and there's a preparation for the life after this, and the preparation is that returning to that place of vulnerability, that place of naked and unashamed, and letting go of some of the things that maybe we've held on to along the way. And our sexual intimacy can be a gift to one another to help one another walk through this redemption process. That's the bigger story. It's not just, are we having really good sex? Are we enjoying sex? There's a whole person sex, but it's even, there's so much more God's doing in
and
this
saying,
relation and saying in this relationship. And so, any like kind of a final way that you want to give an encouragement to stay in that story, or how would you encourage someone to move forward in this?
I think the biggest thing is community of other people who want to stay awake. And what I mean by that is, I always say to people, we understand, if you're a believer, that you're living in a bigger story and that you're not the main character. You play a role, and it's a privilege to play that role, and that God is growing us up and transforming us into his image. And a marriage relationship is one, if you're married, it is one of God's chief tools to do that.
Yes.
And if you will remember, build in the reminders of the bigger story you're living in, because when I forget that and it becomes about whether you loaded the dishwasher or not, or whether you helped with the kids or not, or whether I feel seen by you before you initiate sex with me, whatever those things are, then that becomes that's the small story. And we are living in the small story as well.
And
it's
it
not that
matters.
doesn't matter.
It matters.
That smaller story matters, but always in the context of the bigger one. And when we lose sight of the bigger story, I think we lose all the tools we have to navigate our small stories, and we lose perspective. And the small story becomes the story, and then we're in trouble.
And I would just say we want to give thanks to Christ, who's been so attentive and affectionate towards us, who's given us a vision of oneness, who's been present, who we leaned into individually and together, the work of the Spirit in our lives to keep calling us back to this, the grace that's been given, the love that we've been shown through Christ, the truth in his word of the design and what is real and what the definitions of reality are. All those have been so vital to this relationship. And I say to people, I don't know how you think through all of this, but for us, we really believe that Christ is a part of the relationship that has been non-negotiable and essential. And then I would say to you, Teresa, just thank you for all the years, 40 plus years, and all the years I've prayed that are ahead. Your grace to me, your speaking the truth in love, your willingness to grow, risk, struggle, fail. It's been a little bit like a pioneer wagon crossing to the west, and we've gotten caught in all kinds of storms and difficulties and stresses and weather and terrain and all kinds of things. But what a wonderful journey we've been able to share together. And that's what we long for you to have as well. And it's available in Christ and in each other. We hope you'll join us for our next season when we talk about power, specifically looking at roles and communication and conflict. You can see how important that is to the sexual intimacy journey and to what God designed for marriage. Until that time, thank you for risking, growing, listening, learning, loving with us more about what it means to live in a marriage in the story that God has been telling from the beginning.